Welcome to the Financial Literacy Seminar Series joint with GW and the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. I just wanted to introduce our speaker today, Eric Johnson from Columbia's Business School. Eric is the Norman Egg Chair of Business at the Columbia Business School and Director of the Center for Decision Sciences. His research examines the interface between behavioral decision research, economics, and the decisions made by consumers, managers, and their implications for public policy, markets, and marketing. Among other topics, Eric has explored how the way options are presented to decision makers affect their choices in areas such as organ donation, the choice of environmentally friendly products and investments. According to the Institute of Scientific Information, he is one of the most highly cited scholars in business and economics. Not only that, he can speak well to both economists and from a psychological perspective. I was very impressed. Eric's research and comments have appeared in numerous places such as the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Money, Discover, Business Week, and so on. He's also been on several news programs. His publications have appeared in a wide range of journals, including Science, Psychology Review, the Harvard Business Review, the Journal of Economic Theory. He's also published 2 books, Decision Research, a Field Guide, and The Adaptive Decision Maker. He graduated from Rutgers University and then received his MS and PhD in psychology from Carnegie Mellon and was a National Science Foundation postdoctoral fellow at Stanford. He has previously taught at Carnegie Mellon, MIT, and the University of Pennsylvania. And he's also received funding from numerous institutions, including the NSF, National Institutes of Health, the Alfred P. Sloan and Russell Sage Foundations, and the Office of Naval Research. So, Eric?
What I'd like to do today is give you a talk about some very complicated research and try and make it very simple. And you're going to see, I'll warn you in advance, things that look like someone used to call them Indian wars. There'll be arrows pointing all over the place. But the underlying idea is actually pretty important, but also pretty simple. So if you get freaked out by some of these diagrams, don't. We'll walk you through it. And the second thing I have to say is this is work done with 2 marvelous people who've helped us quite a bit with it. Yi Li, who is about to leave us, sadly, to get a job as a faculty member. Happy for him, sad for us. And Martina Baldassi, who was actually an undergraduate in cognitive science, who's now in graduate school for neuroscience, and also Elke Weber, who also happens to have made the mistake of marrying me somewhere along the way. Also, I should also thank the generous support of NIA. You know, this has been the kind of work you would do if you have 5 years of funding, because it was not easy to get going and not easy to do. And so I really have to thank them for that kind of support. So we have 2 views of older people. The first view is that older people are wiser, the better decision makers. The average age of these people is somewhere in their late 70s. You recognize everybody? And we all think of them as experts at the pinnacle of their skills. But a lot of research shows there are capabilities that oldsters lose, starting at age 20. And so the question is, is older actually wiser, or should we replace them? That's why you shouldn't have seen that, with their younger counterparts. H.L. Mencken put it very well. He said, the older I get, the more I distrust the familiar doctrine that age brings wisdom. So the question we have when it comes to financial decision making, do older people have a problem? This is particularly a problem because as a society, we're putting more decision making on older people. 401ks are becoming things that people have to manage in retirement. So the decumulation problem, I've had a great pleasure of teaching with an economist a course in consumer finance. What was fun about that is he actually wrote the equations for how you decumulate optimally. And then went and said we had to use a supercomputer for 2 days to actually get the estimated answer. This is hard. It's hard for me. And so is it harder for older people? You'd have to think about longevity, how long you're going to live, returns, inflation, future costs, including health costs. This is a tough problem. Yet we're expecting older people to do this. Annuitization, there's no such thing, I think, as a simple annuity contract. One of my friends, Jane Bryan Quinn, says when she looks at an annuity contract that's 200 pages, she doesn't think anybody on earth actually understands that contract. So these are very difficult and complex problems. Healthcare insurance is obviously a very complicated choice, and even something that's such a nice benefit for older people, like Medicare Part D, which lowers their drug costs, can present them with 40 different options in some states. So how do they pick between 40 different plans? Obviously, there are a myriad of housing and health decisions. So if anything, decision-making becomes more complicated as you get older. How do we structure these decisions to maximize people's capabilities and abilities? There's also a lot of interest in this in the financial services community because there are issues that are actually very serious about liability of selling products, complicated products, to older people. So first off, like Willie Sutton, one of the reasons older people are a great target market for firms is, like banks, that's where the money is. 1/3 of all the assets, according to the 2007 survey of consumer finances, is held by households that are 65 and older. 1/3 of the wealth. So this is actually, an important segment for those folks. But there's liability. The Wall Street Journal had this nice article. This nice looking man here is in prison for selling a complex annuity to a woman who was in her 80s, I think, 83-year-old, who happened to be demented. He did not claim, he claims, and I suspect he might be right, he did not detect it. It's very hard. I mean, he's not a clinician. How does he actually know that? Her boyfriend brought her in and said, this worked great for me, you should buy one. And yet he was found guilty. So this issue of when someone is competent, while not the central part of my research, is obviously of a lot of interest. Finally, and this is work that I won't talk about in depth, but even if you're talking simply about public policy decisions, there's a really important set of decisions 97% of all Americans have to make, and that is when to start claiming benefits from Social Security. I didn't know this until I started working with Melissa Knoll, who's here on this, but almost half of Americans start claiming at the earliest possible time, which is actually 62. Now, is that a mistake or not? I'm not going to take a position, but it's a decision that has incredible implications for them. At 62, someone might get $750 a month. If they waited to 70, they get $1,320. And this is for every year of the rest of their lives. So the implications of this choice, particularly given that half of all Americans, Social Security is the biggest part of their post-retirement income, is important. So even if we can figure out how people make this decision, help them do it, it has great public policy. Another statistic which I learned, which is great, 22% of all consumers first think about retirement, they report this, only a year before retirement. Another 22% say they first think about it only 6 months before. That's a very interesting thought, given that most of the models in economics of how people make the decision are life cycle models that say you start optimizing, well, I guess as soon as you can, So here's the story. The simple story today is there are two capabilities that people have, and it's good news and bad news. Let me start with the bad news, and that is there's this capability called fluid intelligence. I'll explain that and give you examples in a second. But it's how fast you can think. It's how you can assemble symbols. It seems very critical to decision making. Here's a typical task, perhaps a prototypical task for this. Now, this may be the hardest question I ask you. Here is what's called a Raven's progressive matrix, and it's a series. Some things change this way, some things change this way. You have to pick which one of these 8 would fill in this blank. Any takers? This is where I want a little button that plays the Jeopardy theme music. B is exactly right. Quite good fluid intelligence. But this is essentially, notice this is very abstract. It's how quickly can you detect patterns and shift them. Now, the bad news is fluid intelligence actually starts decreasing from about age 20. So this is this result is so common in psychology. It's one of the huge regularities that from age 20 on, fluid intelligence differs. In essence, my co-author Yi Li, who's in his late 20s, claims correctly that he has 1 standard deviation of fluid intelligence on me. And whenever we fight, he particularly reminds me of this. But this is actually true for behaviors or skills like memory, speed, reasoning, and space. And it's very much a quite striking pattern. It seems true pretty much universally. So that's the bad news, and would suggest that decision making gets worse as we get older. And we see a bunch of results that seem consistent with that. It looks like people are worse in framing, they're worse in applying decision rules. Some people have argued to be overconfident, and Doman and colleagues argue that they're more risk averse. Now, I'm not sure those are mistakes, but certainly those are changes with age. Sometimes people find no difference in performance for older and younger people. And sometimes older adults are better. So the data is actually surprisingly mixed. So if you ask a simple question, are older adults going to be better or worse decision makers? It doesn't look like the literature supplies a simple answer. Well, one reason we think that is there's good news And there's another skill, which we'll call crystallized intelligence, which is actually the stable repository of knowledge acquired through culture, education, life experience. My favorite example of this is actually the New York Times crossword puzzle. Salthouse has done lots of studies where he compares 20-year-olds and 60-year-olds doing crossword puzzles, and the 60-year-olds are better. Not because they're faster, but they have a bigger database of information. So you want to think about that. I was trying to think of a cute example of this, but if I were to have a 4-letter clue that was STYX, someone who's older might know that was a rock band from the 80s. It was the 80s, wasn't it? 70s. You see, a rock band. It seemed like the 80s to me, or they would know that, but someone who is younger might not. And the kind of classic case of that are measures in the literature of vocabulary. So corpulent is, which of these is the most closest to it, the antonym, an opposite? Sallow, affiliated, emaciated, entrepreneur, or anemic? Emaciated. Okay. And this is the kind of knowledge that people mean by crystallized intelligence. Typically, there's a notation here, GC, C is for crystallized, GF, F is for fluid. And here's another question. How many months are there in a year? Anyone not get that? But these questions try and span a great range of capabilities. And who was Catherine the Great? Now, the interesting thing I'm going to try and tell you is that we use measures, in fact, we use these measures to assess fluid and crystallized intelligence in a panel of older and younger people. And what's interesting is crystallized intelligence will be surprisingly important in making up for this decrease we see in fluid intelligence. So while fluid intelligence leads to a decrease in decision-making performance, we're going to argue that crystallized intelligence will increase. Now, the nice thing about crystallized intelligence, if you want to tell the story, this is also from Salthouse, is it increases with age, at least until 50 or 60, which seems like a natural story, right? As I learn more about the world, I store more, and at least until 50 or 60, that's an increasing trend. Okay. Because this is really important, I'm going to stop here and see if there are any questions. Any questions? Should I hand out the blue books now for the quiz? Okay. So here's the story. And this slide, we really need to make sure I explain it slowly and correctly, because it's going to be the key slide for understanding everything that goes. If you're talking about age, our argument is that's the wrong way of looking at things. It's not age, so you can look for what might be called a direct effect between age and decision performance. You might think that exists, but we're going to argue that's not quite right. In fact, there are going to be two capabilities that you have that will actually determine how well you make a decision. One of those will be fluid intelligence, which remember goes down, so that's GF. And the other that changes with age is GC, or crystallized intelligence. So it could well be you see absolutely no effect of age on decision performance, but in reality you're seeing the average of two indirect effects. Crystallized intelligence getting better with age, and fluid intelligence getting worse with age. This is going to be very, very important because different kinds of tasks will require different amounts of crystallized and fluid intelligence. So we should be able to say you're going to do well on this task if you're older. It'll do not so well on this task if you're older. So that's the basic quick story. So what we're going to do today is basically, we can't manipulate people's age, so we'll get people at different ages to basically give us lots of measures of crystallized intelligence, lots of measures of fluid intelligence, and see if we can predict how well they do. And actually argue that what this does is missing this big story. So sort of give you the headline, we're going to look at the paths between these two kinds of intelligences and decision performance. And intelligence, of course, is always good. So both crystallized and fluid intelligence should be positively related to performance. Okay? But because what we know about age is that for fluid intelligence, as I get older, this goes down. And so this is actually going to be age will lead to worse performance. However, for crystallized intelligence, we expect a positive connection, and that's going to lead to better performance. And if you want to do the play along at home with the math, essentially if you multiply this times this, you get a measure of how important this effect is. That's what the notation here says. And if you're going to multiply this times this, that's going to show you how much the negative effect is. So basically think about it, it ain't age, It's essentially fluid and crystallized intelligence that you need to worry about. Now, that is a really important chart because I'm going to essentially walk you through that. So I want to make sure people understand that. Are there any questions?
Is there still a predictability? Because in a sense, age as this potentially simplicity that you can tell an advisor, right? That
Don't do it after 65 or 72 or something like that.
But in a sense, could you replace it maybe with a simple test if age is not anymore the predictable or the variable to use?
It's a very good question, and one of the questions, well, there'll be two questions. Let me answer that this way. One is, can I change these two? Right, because I want to improve performance, can I change these two? And I'll give you the brief answer is yes, and not at all clear. Okay, so one is intervention. A second version of that is, can I make decisions easier for people so they don't require as much as fluid intelligence? So I will talk about that. You're asking a third question, which I think is a very important question, which is, can I detect this? Can I diagnose particularly increases in here in fluid intelligence? And that's tough. It was tough for us. Our respondents, I'll tell you, did about 2 to 3 hours worth of tasks for us to measure these things reliably. There are now some computerized tests that will let you do that quickly. I don't think there's anything quite yet that says, okay, before I sell you this annuity, please press these 3 buttons and answer these questions. Now, one thing I should say is we're trying hard to exclude people who have dementia. In fact, we test everybody for dementia, and all of our subjects fail. So there is a large portion of the population, particularly when you get into the mid and late 80s, where dementia is a big thing that's going on. But it's traditional in this area. We're interested in these two processes. Dementia is not part of what we're going to study. Now, dementia testing is, in fact, a different thing, and that might be more doable, sort of to answer Anna's question. Other questions? Think about this microphone. You feel like you're booming out at people, so it helps if you ask questions. Yeah, please.
So there's obviously variation in fluid intelligence. Does the rate of decline vary by the level of fluid intelligence, or is it individual specific?
We know a little bit about this, and it's actually quite interesting. It's a developing area of research. It turns out that people who are educated and active tend to hold their fluid intelligence longer. Okay, so it actually, there's some fairly strong correlations between those kinds of variables. So education, bilinguals tend to have better fluid intelligence. And so some of them aren't theoretical, they're more empirical. But yes, we do know that, in fact, there's a lot of differences in how quickly fluid intelligence decreases. And so that I'll talk a little bit about at the end, but it's a really good question. Please. Well, this is why I sort of said it's controversial. There was actually, I was impressed, the New York Times had a long piece on essentially this question, can you do that? And it's not my particular expertise. There are certainly papers that have been published that claim that you can, through exercise, through brain exercises, increase that. Whether that, it's still quite controversial. We just, in our grant proposal, said, we actually don't think you can, we're quite there yet. I should say the following. Luminosity was very nice to us. We used some of their tests as measures, not as interventions. So you helped us. Thank you very much. But yes, but that would certainly be a claim. So I'll just say I think the data's out on that. It would be nice if it were true. And there are lots of people who are pursuing that. There's almost like a whole space program about trying to do that. And I will just say I'll suspend judgment for right now. But obviously it would be great and important if you could do it. So basically, red for everything we show is the bad stuff. It shows decreases in performance. Green is the good stuff. You should show increases in performance. Okay. Please.
Do we have to think of the crystallized intelligence as being domain specific?
It's a really good question.
They have to know about financial products, or it doesn't really matter if they know about these things?
Well,
can you repeat the question?
yeah, I'll repeat. So is crystallized intelligence, maybe I can repeat it well. Is crystallized intelligence domain specific? For example, is it financially specific, or is it about, what's amazing to us is when we started this, we didn't realize that crystallized intelligence would be sort of the buffer it is. So when we started using standard tests, what would knowing who Catherine the Great was help you do better in borrowing? Yet something about these measures does. So, and none of our measures of crystallized intelligence are going to be domain specific.
So can it be something about the ability to retain the information? And it seems
Yeah.
like with crystallized intelligence, the I mean, if I have connection to the internet, I can look up like I can find the piece of information. Whereas, like you said, there isn't something I can do to just instantly become more fluidly intelligent. So.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. But it's also, I mean, think about that. You have to know where to go. So you have to remember the name of the sites. You have to know that. So it's like as if crystallized intelligence probably helps search as well. Any other questions?
So you're saying that, because everybody says just Google it. So that doesn't, I think that was her point, is you can just Google it.
Yeah.
It
Just,
doesn't make up
I mean,
us with intelligence.
Well, I mean, the thing is you have to, A, remember the name of the sites to Google, right? And who to trust. I mean,
yeah,
you know,
the trust is, that you
Yeah.
do, but now that's the problem with all the blogs, especially in financial literacy.
Yeah, no, so I think these are really valid and important questions. And you know, there was a literature on what sometimes gets called cognitive aids, or augmented cognition. And I think that would be, that's another talk, perhaps. Not my talk, actually. But you know, one could go that way. There was another question. Please.
I'm wondering if you think there's an interaction between the two. I don't want to play too much with your definitions, but it seems like you can think of crystallized intelligence as calcified intelligence and prejudice, which may limit your ability to draw upon the fluid intelligence.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So you have the effect of both on decision performance, but there might also be an interaction between the two.
That's right. We will look at that in our data. That will not be there in our data, although conceptually I agree with you. It could be the case that relying too much on crystallized intelligence doesn't work in new situations. Sort of a version of that thought that I do believe happens, and is different tasks will require different kinds of intelligence. And so basically you can imagine tasks that require a lot of fluid intelligence won't be so good for older people. So that's a version of your thought, I think. There was another question over here.
Could you talk more about what you mean by culture in terms of depth of knowledge for crystallized knowledge? I'm wondering if that means sort of rules of thumb that you might learn from your parents, or habits of using financial services, or is there something more?
Yeah. No, I mean, that's not our definition, but it's a definition that's commonly used, and it just means cultural products, things you learn. So I was thinking about this because we were talking about this over lunch. Like the rule of 72 is probably a piece of crystallized intelligence. It's an algorithm. It's a rule of thumb that lets you do things, and actually makes it easier for you to do that. So if you were impaired in fluid intelligence, the rule of 72 might help you there. So that would be one not particularly deep example. Okay. Maybe when I actually show you the data and the tasks, the definitions might be a little bit clearer. But I think these are all very good questions. So basically, this is what we mean by compensating cognitive capabilities. That while this is hurting, this is helping, and that for a large part of the lifespan, you're going to end up seeing no effective age. Okay. So what do we mean by decision making? Well, this is the point where I turn the talk over to Anna, since she's responsible for so much of this work. We're going to use measures of financial literacy and debt literacy that have been shown to be correlated with real-world outcomes. And so there are things I'm sure Anna has never seen before. There are 3 questions we use in our respondents. So, FL1, which I think everybody here knows, is imagine the interest rate on your savings account was 1% per year. Inflation was 2% per year. After 1 year, would you be able to buy more than exactly the same as or less than today with the money in this account? Now, when I show this to our Columbia MBAs, they don't believe anyone on earth gets this question wrong. That's called another bias, called projection bias. But Anna, the actual answer is in the 30%, 30, 40%?
60% in the population.
In the population. Okay. So this is one of the decision-making skills we think we're going to be interested in, along with debt literacy. The other 2 are ones that are much closer to the decision-making literature and economics literature, and that is temporal discounting. This is the degree to which people discount the future. So a classic example of this, do you want $100 today or $160 in 4 weeks? Now everyone here is very patient and will say the $160 in 4 weeks, but much of the population will take, in fact, the smaller, sooner reward. Turns out this is a variable that has sort of surprised me. It really has turned out to have a lot of predictive validity. And if you look, there are positive and significant, not huge, but significant correlations with things like body mass index. Why? Well, how do you get to be overweight? You take more pleasure now when the consequences are later. Smoking, smokers tend to have higher discount rates. Wealth, and this correlates with savings, mortgage choice. There was a nice paper by my colleague Stefan Meyer, who was here a little while ago, who just showed that basically FICO scores and discount rates are correlated. And we actually ended up replicating that. So that turns out to be something we're going to be very interested in because it really does matter. And so this is how we measure it. Our respondents get questions like this: do you want $60 today or $65 per month today? And hopefully, what do? Well, they keep checking 65, 75, until they switch. And at that point, we basically saying they're moving from their equivalent between today and tomorrow. So they might say $60 today, $60 today. Oh, here I'm going to switch to 85. And then they keep checking 85. So that gives us essentially a measure of how patient they are. For loss aversion, is this measure? It's sort of the big concept now in behavioral economics when it comes to people's reactions to gains and losses. As you may know, the standard factoid is that people weight losses twice as much as they enjoy gains. So we're trying to measure that, and it's incredibly important in lots of domains. My favorite example is it actually turns out to be able to help you understand people's reactions to mental accounts, investing mistakes. Here's the kind of item we use. Would you play a gamble that you lost 50 cents and gained $6? At this point, almost everybody in this room's hand should go up. How about $1? How about $1.50? How about $2? At some point, again, you're going to switch from here to here, and that gives us a measure of your loss aversion. Sort of a modal answer in the population is they'll switch at $3 and gain 6, which means your loss aversion is 2 because the gain, roughly speaking, is twice as large as the loss. I look at it as a scale, so it measures basically how much more weight you're putting on the losses. So those are our dependent measures. Now, those are kind of standard. The cognitive measures are also kind of standard, but from a different world. We use the Raven's regressive matrices, what's the task that you saw earlier. Letter series, which is adapted from Salthouse, which is basically in the example, which one of these essentially is not like the other, for those of you who remember Sesame Street. And it turns out THIK is the only one that does not contain the letter L, so that would be the right answer. Here is a number series completion, which is actually, I believe, on the cognitive survey. And we use the adaptive version of that, so we try and overlap a little bit with HRS. And basically says completion. Now, what I realized when I was walking through the talk is I forgot. Do you remember what the right answer is for this? Oh, okay. What is it? 7, thank you. And that's primes? No, 35 is not a prime.
+2, +4,
Thank you. Okay, so we do that. So obviously you understand my fluid intelligence is now decremented and E is right. Numeracy, which is the Lipkiss type items, the chance of getting a viral infection is 0.0005 out of 10,000 people. How many people are them expected to get infected? Cognitive reflection task, which is due to Shane Frederick. Many of you probably have seen this item. It's essentially a bat and a ball is cost $1.10 in total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Everyone's first answer is 10 cents. The reality is 5 cents is the right answer. And this has been shown, for example, to be related to discounting. So these measures actually are relatively new to our research and not part of the standard use of a definition of fluid intelligence. Crystallized intelligence use Shipley's vocabulary test, an antonym vocabulary test, and the information test from the WACE. One thing, just a sidelight we did, is we actually used a lot of the same instruments that have been used in Project Create, because we get their data and we actually compare offline versus online administration. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And we measured a third capability. I'm not going to have the time to talk about it today, although it was something we were very excited by. It turned out to be empirically kind of disappointing: inhibitory control. And these are tests like the Stroop test, the flanker test, and the spatial one-back task. We actually had essentially let Lumosity Labs have these nice, sexy online games that are actually sort of fun. And so we actually use those not as treatments, but as measures. And they turn out to be psychometrically actually quite clean. And it's nice because people like doing these tasks. If you take the tasks usually, they're very boring. But when it's birds flying left and right and you get to pick which way they're going, it's kind of fun, right? Yeah, so subjects actually like this, which is good because we're going to ask them to do a lot of these measures. Okay, our data is going to come from, this is all done on the line. We have a final panel of 336 participants who are part of a database we have of people who are willing to do online research. These people are sampled to be either young or old, below 30 or above 60.
That old people online are atypical?
Well, so this is a good question. If maybe afterwards you want to, we actually compare them to the U.S. population. Our sample is a little bit more female, which is typical actually of online panels. A second thing that's true is they tend to be slightly more educated, but it turns out since most of our old people, remember, our mean is 66.4 or below 70, internet penetration, if I were to show you the graph, is actually pretty significant for those folks. So I think there is, but if you look at the demographics, there's really not much difference between them. I think if you're going to 80 and above, or 70 and above, we were talking about this earlier, there are going to be much bigger differences. For us, remember though, our goal is to test theory and not describe the level of fluid intelligence in a representative sample of the US. So unless you thought that this breaks down when you get people who don't have computers at home, that would be something that concerns us. We just think we're dealing with modestly better than average people. But not, they're not all rocket scientists. When you look at demographics like education and income, they're very close to standard. We actually got these people to do waves that took about 40 minutes 4 times. So this is one of the advantages. Well, this is a lot of time. It was a lot of work. The same participants, this 336, completed all the waves. The last wave was done 1 year afterwards. The one thing that I think is spectacular about this data is we can measure stability of the decision-making skills. So we have people doing the same task 1 year later. I'll show you those results. I think they're actually quite surprising and quite striking. Our dropout rates happen. People who we cancel, contact a year later, only about 8% complete because they move, they die, whatever. But we look, and no demographic, cognitive, or decision-making variable predicts dropouts. So our dropout rates are essentially randomly distributed among our respondents from everything we can tell. We've tried 6 different ways from Sunday to try and find that. Okay, so here's where the arrows are going to get confusing, but I will walk you through them. Financial literacy. So these are those 3 questions. What this is telling you is essentially what's the correlation between these financial literacy measures? The answer is high. They hang together. Debt literacy. The answer is high. They actually measure the same thing. Temporal discounting. They actually are quite high. They hang together. And loss aversion. Now the first sort of remarkable thing here, I think, is you look at the green items and the blue items here. Those are done a year apart. So we expect people to not be stable. If this wasn't like a trait, if this wasn't like whether people are tall or short, these correlations in green to be lower than the correlations in blue. In fact, if anything, they're higher. This is amazing. That essentially, this is almost like a personality variable. Turns out that temporal this is, as I was talking about this at the University of Chicago on Tuesday, they were saying this is almost as good as any personality variable. So it looks like discounting is actually very stable. Same thing is true for loss aversion. We end up getting very high loadings and sort of the magic of doing this, which is some combination of factor analysis and regression, that's called structural equation modeling, is you can test what's the best model. And it says basically you need a model that has these 4 things, and the 4 things are separate. This is a quick question for anyone who knows structural equation modeling to say, did you do this? And I get to say, I think so. But we've tried to do this, we've had a lot of good help with this. Okay, so those are 12 months later. Here's the correlations between them. So interestingly enough, financial literacy is the biggest correlation is between financial literacy and debt literacy, but still it turns out you need 2 different scales for that. Loss aversion and temporal discounting are only lightly correlated. Temporal discounting is related to debt literacy and financial literacy. But basically these things all look like they have to be separate. They're 4 separable skills. The closest question is this, but they still have half the variance, roughly speaking, is independent. Okay? Here is going to be, I'm going to do this kind of quickly because I don't want to spend the rest of our talk talking about this. But this is our cognitive capabilities. So GF, everything is nicely correlated. GC, everything is nicely correlated. Same thing with inhibitory control. And the correlations here are high, and GF and GC are highly correlated, but still about half the variance is unique. It says basically people who are fluidly intelligent are on average have higher crystallized intelligence, but there still are individual differences and they're systematic. Okay. And by the way, in all of this, we're going to control for gender, for income, and for education. So basically, we've already included in these models those factors. So what's left over is after you've controlled for education. What's nice here, comforting for those of you who are testing geeks, is education and crystallized intelligence are pretty highly correlated. That's sort of people's measure in this world of whether it's crystallized intelligence. Because how do you get crystallized intelligence? One way is going to school. So we're actually quite pleased that that turned out that way.
Just ask a
Please.
question.
Sure, please.
And clearly the data are tuning out this way, if I'm reading the graph correctly, that numeracy contributes to the fluid intelligence rather than
Yes.
crystallized intelligence.
Yes, so that's actually an important thing. Many people have taken CRT
It's
particularly.
quite surprising to me, yeah.
Yeah, now, the data says that quite clearly.
And is that the standard appreciation, let's say, in the literature, that it should be on the fluid side? Or is that simply the data is telling you that, and maybe someday we'll figure out from an intuitive or a theoretical perspective why that is?
Well, I guess there's two things. One is, let me speak to CRT. What many people have talked about is a measure of your reliance on system 1, system 2. That turns out, and other labs have reported this, that turns out to essentially be a fluid intelligence scale. It really is sort of just how fast you are. And those people who are fast catch themselves making a mistake. The same labs, and this is work done by Ellen Peters, ends up showing that numeracy ends up often being loading on a GF factor. And so if you want to think about this as and we've tried the obvious models, which is let's break GF into 2 categories. They don't add anything. They really are measuring the same thing. And one way, just to help you with this says that half the variance in CRT, roughly, a little bit less, is accounted for by fluid intelligence. And I've simplified this. There's a lot of error variance there. So it turns out that it looks to us like it's essentially a subset of fluid intelligence. It's not to say it doesn't have other characteristics, but by and large, you do a pretty good job with it. So, I mean, the data is surprising to us how nicely that element turned out. Although it's surprising because, boy, do a lot of people think CRT is measuring something else. But now when we have a large set of samples, we end up seeing the CRT actually is largely a numeric capability. Now notice one thing here is we do have both visual, Ravens is a visual task, numeric tasks, and symbolic tasks, all loading in fluid intelligence. So we played with models that might try our numbers special, and they don't seem to work in our data better. It's not to say if we had a sample of 6,000, you might not find significant differences statistically, but I think these get a good job of the substantive difference. Any other questions? Okay. So again, we controlled for various demographics. Okay, and SEM, here's what we're going to do. Age, we'll try and predict each of the decision variables. Okay, that's sort of where we start, but we don't think that's all that's going on. So when I said Indian Wars, I was thinking about this particular graph. What we think age is really affecting is crystallized and fluid intelligence, and for the sake of today, I'm going to pretty much skip this. And that those will be the things that influence financial literacy, debt literacy, and temporal discounting. Now, again, to make this really scary, we control for education, income, and gender. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do is not show you numbers on this horrible chart, but basically show you a chart separately for financial literacy, debt literacy, temporal discounting, and loss aversion. And here, I think you'll find mostly a very simple story. So at first, we want to first look to see if age is affecting these things. We're going to then see if age affects financial literacy, debt literacy, and then finally third, we're going to see if it really is the mediators, crystallized and fluid intelligence. Okay, so what does our data show? When all this fancy econometrics and actually I should probably just say simple psychometrics is done, we see that, in fact, fluid intelligence in our sample decreases between people who are 25 on average and people who are 66 on average. And if you look about it, Yi was right. I'm close to having lost a full standard deviation based on him. I also point out to him, though, that on crystallized intelligence, I'm doing really well. I have probably a standard deviation roughly on him, and our data show that. So we really replicate sort of this very standard finding, even though we're doing things on the web with this sample, which is not necessarily. By the way, most of this research is done with convenient samples previously. People would come into your lab, so it's not as nice as some of the other work that's been done with national samples, but it replicates that. We find inhibitory control, which correlates a bit with fluid intelligence, also goes down. Here, remember, is the chart that I showed you originally? We're doing very much like what's done in previous research. So we're seeing crystallized intelligence going up and fluid intelligence going down. Okay, so let's see how decision performance happens with age. I've shown you we get this nice crossover pattern for intelligence. Turns out that the older people in our sample are more financially literate. Actually, significantly, almost as I point out to Yi, actually he's much more financially literate. He's an econ PhD from Chicago. How could I be nearly as financially literate as him? But it's about a standard deviation. They are also more debt literate. They're still significantly more patient, but it's much less. And we get a tendency, but not a significant decrease in loss aversion. So we're basically seeing there are differences, and those differences are not that older people are deteriorating. In fact, for our sample and for the age groups we're looking at, they actually, if anything, are increasing in skill. So here's the story. Is what's going on here about the main effect of age was about the separate effects of crystallized and fluid intelligence. So here we see that age has a correlation, if you will, of 0.41 with financial literacy. That looks like it's really good news, doesn't it? Old people, we don't have to worry about them. Oops, don't hit that button. So here's something you're going to see a lot. What's happening to crystallized intelligence? This is positive, it's going up. Everyone see it's a positive coefficient? I understand this is, but that's an easy. It's green, it's good. Fluid intelligence, red, it's bad, it's going down. Notice the size of those effects in our data, almost identical. And so what happens is financial literacy, that in fact, if you have more crystallized intelligence, hooray, you're going to actually have an increase in financial literacy. If you have more fluid intelligence, you're going to have an increase in financial literacy. But look at what's happening. This is decreasing older people, so their performance is going to go down. So essentially two paths, and when push comes to shove, it looks like essentially some part of this disappears. That a large part of what's going on is you're getting an increase in crystallized intelligence, a decrease in fluid intelligence. In this task, it turns out crystallized intelligence is slightly more important, and you get an increase in performance. So this is good news, but it's going to be complicated because what happens to crystallized intelligence after 60? Well, we'll see it flattens out. And what's happening to fluid intelligence after 60? Well, the same thing that happened from 20, 30, 40, 50, it's going to go down. So understanding these two paths is critically important to understanding what's going to happen later on in life. And again, we're controlling for demographics. Debt literacy, this is exactly the same. So what happens here? Again, you get this nice positive path through crystallized intelligence, a negative path through fluid intelligence. In fact, this is quite a big effect. And that's going to actually account for a lot of the variability due to age. Temporal discounting, again, a positive effect due to crystallized intelligence, a negative effect for fluid intelligence. And again, intelligence is good, but we're seeing that because older people are decreasing in fluid intelligence, that's a negative path. So think of it this way, positive times a positive is a positive, that's good. A negative times a positive is a negative, that's bad. So there's increases and decreases that are happening with age. You just don't see them because, particularly in this measure, because it doesn't look like there's anything going on or very small effect of age. These are much more significant than the direct path. Now I want to stop there and see if there are questions. So that's our simple story.
for example, the elderly about how much they think they know
Mhm.
about economics and finance,
Mhm.
what they do, they tend to give themselves very high rating. And I wonder whether, in principle, they probably are thinking more of their crystallized intelligence potentially. And then I explain why there is this big discrepancy between what they think they know and then how they do actually in the test, in particular if we ask numeracy questions.
Yeah, it's sort of a metacognition as well. No, it's an excellent question. I don't know of any research that looks at overconfidence. We, by the way, looked at lots of other measures, but not overconfidence in the elderly. It's a good question. I don't know an answer. Other question, please.
Is this just identifying off the young group and the old group, or is this using that panel, the repeated measurement?
In terms of, yeah, so we've done this two ways. One is we've done it as an SEM with two panels to see if the things are identical. And I believe these results are coming from using age as a 0-1 variable in another analysis. We replicate by and large the same data with the panel analysis, essentially saying, this is sort of a statistical sidebar, so sorry, but essentially saying what coefficients differ for younger and older people. And we get the same results both ways. Okay, for loss aversion, we end up with a pattern that, just to show you that I'm honest, that's not nearly as pretty. It turns out that neither crystallized or fluid intelligence seem to be the thing that's determining loss aversion. In fact, we think it's inhibitory control. Because I'm going to keep our conversation simpler today, I'm not going to delve into this. We think a lot of it has to do with how we ask the question. But I won't talk about it. So the answer here is we don't understand loss aversion. Even though people seem to be systematically, across the course of a year, more or less loss averse. Okay, now here's where I ask you to fill in the chart. What we're showing you is at age, here's the basic result. Older people are more financially literate, more debt literate, they're somewhat more better at discounting, and somewhat less loss averse. That's, if you look just at age, that would be the story you would find. But notice the results in this area are quite mixed. Why? Because they're not looking at the right things. What we should be looking at is not the direct effect, but instead the effects of GC and GF. And what you see here is GF is going down, GC is going up, and that's going to have different consequences for decision making. So basically the story here is more GC is good, more GF would be good, but older people are losing it, quite literally, losing GF as they get older. Please.
If fluid intelligence is going down as your age goes up, but financial literacy increases, and numeracy is fluid, does that speak to them being different things? Because a lot of times people question, is financial literacy just numeracy?
Right,
But this
right.
kind of separates them.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. And so let me just repeat it to make sure I understand. But basically, we know that numeracy looks like fluid intelligence. And fluid intelligence is going down with age. Well, what's happening then if literacy is going up with age? And I think our answer is that it looks like what's happening here, if I flip back, is what's getting older people to do better is crystallized intelligence despite their decreases in fluid intelligence. So it says, yeah, it's not just numeracy. And so the answer is yes. I mean, there's correlations there, but at the effective age, and that's the important thing here, the effective age is because you get compensation. Yeah, it's an excellent point. So here's, I think, the takeaway I really want, because it looks like a good news, right? When I say compensation, it sounds like, oh, I'm getting older, I'm getting worse, but I'm getting better, and all's good, as my nephew keeps saying. All's good, it's okay. Well, remember, people at 66 are the average in our older sample. And what happens when people aren't? And I'm talking, again, I want to point out, this is not dementia. We've screened for dementia, and the data I'm going to show you are free of the effects of dementia. We didn't collect people in the middle. Maybe they're actually even better than our older people. We don't know. We just have two ends of the line. One thing we can do is take the standard results. This is from Salthouse's lab, but again, we can say, what happens if we plug in our model these values? Now notice one important thing here. the decrease in fluid intelligence is essentially linear. But the increase in crystallized intelligence sort of stops around 60. I'm getting very close to being as good as I'm ever going to be at doing New York Times crossword puzzles. Now that's depressing. But so what happens if we were to plug in essentially what we see in this data into our model? Can we project out to what happens to people who are 70, 80, and 90? And the answer is very discouraging for those who are above 80. You get this nice pattern where basically people increase, reaching their peak somewhere in their mid-50s, but then because of the decrease in financial literacy and fluid intelligence, you'll see huge increases in debt literacy, significant increases in patience, and decreases in financial literacy. So what this is saying is basically what looks like a happy story right now will be less happy for those people who are 70, 80, and 90. So this is actually, I think, sort of the most important result we have. And it's why this model that has two components is really important, because you were just saying it's age, you wouldn't understand why you're getting this pattern. Please.
You said 70s, because that seems to be the question for CFPB and some of the others. What is the magic age where they're going around the country doing these talking sessions, and they're trying to deal with the Attorney General saying, when should we step in?
Right.
I mean, I think this is really important research because they're interested in that, because they're taking anecdotal evidence and they're just like writing regulations on that, which I think is a little scary myself.
Yeah, and I think that obviously this project is partly about developing a model to help us understand that phenomenon, but it helps us leverage a little bit of what we already know about the decrease, which is that there are lots of things that actually are demographics that slow down the decrease in fluid intelligence. People who are educated, people who are active. So, and I'm not saying those are interventions, they might turn out to be, but it turns out there's going to be a lot of heterogeneity, so there's no, age is the wrong thing to look at, is what we're saying. There's going to be no one-size-fits-all sort of age where you no longer should be making decisions.
But when you're writing a regulation, it's kind of hard
I know.
to do what you're saying.
By the way, before you open that annuity, you have to go to the website and fill out 4 hours worth of, I understand that. And this work is not meant to be right now implementable, but there are pretty easy tests for doing fluid testing.
The MMI.
And I think someone might want to think about consumers wanting to know what their fluid intelligence is. I mean, they may be interested in self-diagnosis or not, but it's a possibility. There also could be markers, right?
But you have the problem. Sandel just said, his famous secret shopper, and the
Right.
financial advisors are actually doing the reverse of what they should.
No, that's right. And I mean, of course, that happens here too, right? But it certainly could be, particularly when it comes to financial literacy and debt literacy, what this suggests is more important. This, by the way, I should say, is also very similar to a result that Sumit Agarwal and colleagues have, where they actually look, they don't have any of the cognitive measures. What they've done is basically taken outcomes in the real financial market, like how good are you at borrowing, what interest rate do you pay? In their data set, they think they have 11, if I remember correctly, different financial outcomes. What's your mortgage rate, adjusted for FICO and everything that they can. And they find, what's the peak? 53. So it's very consistent with that. We're basically, one way of putting this is we're putting the cognitive measures into something that actually is I think, very much like the Leibson story, Agarwal et al. Story.
So would help play into that at all?
One of the things that seems to be a correlate of I keep saying, because fluid intelligence is going to end up being health. It turns out people who are healthier, who are more active, physical activity, seems to be something that delays the decrease in both fluid but particularly fluid intelligence. It turns out there's a lot of research that actually sort of looking at this pattern, but we're looking at essentially cognitive functioning, executive skill, and things like that. And so there's a big literature that one of the nice things about this research, it connects that literature with financial outcomes. So it suggests, and here I'm being tentative, but it suggests that there are things that we can encourage people to do to help prevent this decline. I want to tell you about new results, and I want to point out to the audience at home, these are very preliminary. But one of the things that we've been actually kind of excited is I've managed to convince one of the large credit reporting agencies, who will remain nameless, to give us these people's FICO records. So the question is, of what we're seeing in measures like financial literacy, debt literacy, discounting, and loss aversion, going to also affect the FICO scores. So, you know, this is, you guys are the first to see this. As you probably know, FICO scores are complex things. So we have all 330, I think, fields from this particular company for, let me go back, for essentially 74% of our sample. We're able to match them. We basically send off the information we had, and we get back the FICO score. We got 2 polls, soft polls of their FICO record, February 2009 and January 2012. Correlation between the two is about, R is about 0.80. So there's a lot of stability there, even in a time that's financially very turbulent. One of the things we're going to be very interested in looking at, by the way, is what's changed between 2009, what predicts change in between this 3-year period. Just to let you know, mean FICO score, and I use FICO as I'm not, let me make it clear, this is not necessarily Fair Isaac score, just FICO-like credit reporting numbers, increases by 13 points. We get slightly better matches between our young and an old. We have to go back and make sure there are no systematic differences between the people who match and don't match. So we've not done that yet. We have to do that. But again, what's going to be interesting when we look, we're going to only look at the average of FICO score. We see that age increases FICO score, which is not surprising. Why would it not be surprising? This I've been teaching a lot lately, so I'll cold call on somebody. No, but why would what?
Credit history, length of credit history.
Length of credit history, and what else happens as you get older?
Pay down your debt.
You pay down your debt and you make more money. So that alone is not surprising.
Yeah, but income isn't in your credit report.
But no, but if you have, yeah, you're right. But if you have more money, you might be able, yeah, you're right. It smarts about your debts. It's not just that. But we're going to want to include income just as a covariate, which we do. So essentially what I'm going to do is add now FICO as a new kind of dependent measure along with that. And this is, you've seen before, it's just the same story about crystallized and fluid intelligence. What's interesting is crystallized intelligence produces an increase in FICO score, significant at 0.18. Fluid intelligence also produces an increase in FICO score, which is 0.31. In fact, this is a case where FICO looks like it's more driven by fluid intelligence than crystallized intelligence. But what's interesting is basically you see the same pattern, that the fluid intelligence eventually is going to decrease for very old people. And this is in, and so both of these paths are significant, and we've controlled for education. Income is positively correlated with FICO score and gender. So it looks like the pattern we're seeing in these measures of loss of literacy, loss aversion, et cetera, happens as well for FICO score. And so that's, I think we're kind of excited by that. A question which I can't share the answer to is that because of other variables like discounting that mediate that change? And if you held a gun to my head, I would say discounting is the biggest thing that's creating that, but we need to do more analysis to get that down. So since this is on the website, I have no clue, since I don't want to be liable for that. Okay, a little sidelight just because it's fun, because there are people here who know this literature, and I'll be turning it over for questions in just a second. One of the basic constructs of life cycle models is how long you're going to live, and this is just a fun result. Basically, you should know approximately when you're going to die, so you know how much to save, what mortgage to buy, how much to, okay, you got this. You can ask this question 2 ways. What's the probability you'll live to age, let's say 85? Or what's the probability that you die by age 85? Those numbers should in fact be related. 1 minus the probability you're going to die by should give you the probability you're going to live to. Okay. One of the things that psychologists worry about is question framing, and here there's a very specific theory, and will those be the same number? And this, by the way, live to is how the HRS asks this question. And we use exactly the HRS format for this work. Here's the result. This is the die-by frame. That's the live to frame. What does it say? That people, when they're asked how long they live to, will on average if we look at the 50% probability line, say 9.6 years longer. So I kiddingly say, how do you live 10 years longer? Well, ask yourself the question in the live to frame. This is sort of, I'm putting this in part because I think it's interesting to demonstrate how psychologists think about variables like this. We think that actually it's a variable that's constructed, that people are actually generating an answer not because they have the number in their head. If I asked you, what's your date you'll be 50% likely to die by? And anyone? Everyone have an answer?
What's the question?
Okay,
We have a calculator that we.
Yeah,
you down to
you're making my point.
Our actuaries have the whole table.
Now you could tell me the answer much better than I could generate it myself.
We have a calculator. You can just type
Yes.
it in, and you have a 50% chance of you or your wife making it to 95.
Right. But my point is very simple. That calculator doesn't exist up here, and how people answer that question is largely a function of how that question is asked. It's not to say they don't get it right. People who are older say they have longer longevity. Women say they'll live longer than men. They have roughly those elements, but there's something else going on there. Okay, that was just sort of mine. So let's go to talk about the implications of the work we've done today. One of the things we know is that I think financial education might help because it helps crystallize intelligence. That's a hypothesis, but notice that's the way that would work. But fluid intelligence is really a challenge. I mean, as I said earlier, I think it's pretty controversial whether you can easily intervene in a long-lasting way to increase fluid intelligence. There are things that certainly are correlates of that, but whether an intervention works, I think is still an open question.
Can you do anything to stabilize it? So not looking to increase, but just not looking to lose as quickly.
You know, this is an area where
It's getting personal. Be 54 on Saturday.
Hey,
Yeah.
I have more motivation. I won't tell you how old I am, but I have more motivation than you. And I mean, there's lots of hints now, but it's not as if there are easy interventions. You know, being active, not spending your time. There are things that seem to work, but I think that's going to be a little while before we know the answer to that for sure. But I do think one thing we can do now is change the choice architecture. So my lessons from Medicare Part D, in some places people were given 40, 50, 60 options. That puts a huge burden on people's speed of processing, or what I'm calling fluid intelligence. That basically I'd have to go and say, oh, simple question like, which one of these has the best deductible? I might be able to do that with 4, but with 60, that's really, really hard. That just, you know, it's going to be much harder for an older person than a young person. So should there be dozens of options? The answer is probably not. You need some way of reducing the subset if you're going to expect people to make the right choice. Now this raises an issue that I think is really, really, really important, which is you're actually, in this case, being paternalistic. You're actually telling people that here are the plans you should think about, which to people who believe in a market economy is a bit threatening and quite a concern. Now, so here's a crazy idea that I have, which is actually, I think, perhaps a way of answering that, which is I call it the easy path idea. Just like you have an easy pass for your car, perhaps we should give people choices in how they get decisions. For some people who want to see all 60 choices, maybe we give them, here's the original Massachusetts Connector, which gives you 48 plans for health insurance. But just in case you don't want to do that, here's an easy path where we have used the following rules to give you a subset. It's entirely up to you. So give the choice about how to make the choice to the person. Now you can't complain that you're taking choice away from people. You're just giving people who might think they're not doing they might benefit from the smaller subset, the choice of using that. Dave?
How about for the actual, what really happened, where they randomly just put the people in and refused to choose?
Well,
How do you feel about those people? You know, because that was the majority. They just randomly put them in because it was just too many choices and they gave up.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that's probably worse than my easy path idea.
Right, I mean,
Right.
because they're now talking about, because of ACA, we've heard from CMS, they're looking at trying to do some things with the exchanges. So it might not hurt for you to talk to since you're already associated with HHS or ideas?
So, little sidebar, sorry, but I spent some time actually with Socio yesterday. We've been doing a series of studies looking at not aging, but just how can people calculate what their best insurance policy is on an exchange. The answer is without decision aids, they perform almost a chance. Okay, but and so I gave this, by the way, to my Columbia MBAs. You know, basically, which of these 8 policies is the most cost effective? And we tell them how many times they're going to go to the doctor. We tell them how much out-of-pocket costs are. So we're taking all the risk away. Columbia MBAs can do this. They take twice as long as ordinary people, and 60% of them report using Excel. We didn't tell them to. They just, okay, I need Excel to do this task. So to your point, we've been working on this, and it turns out if you do the calculation for people, what is called a calculator is available on some sites, and this is important, explain what the calculator is doing, and default them into the most cost-effective policy. These people, and I should say these aren't students, these are people who are in the target market for the exchanges that goes in. These people do as well as Columbia MBAs. So good choice architecture, it's a nice question because it fits in this. Good choice architecture can overcome deficits. Yeah, and that, I think, is sort of the point. That is, the real benefit of this is saying if people are having trouble because of fluid intelligence, you need to generate tasks that minimize the demand on fluid intelligence. That's sort of the real world. And so the next steps, we're going to actually, you saw the first slide, we're going to start looking at the credit reports and seeing how these various skills, so for example, does debt literacy, financial literacy, and I can tell you it is the case that that temporal preferences do influence FICO scores significantly. Okay, sorry, almost made me finish this slide. So let me just say that there are going to be lots of places where I think choice architecture can have an influence in helping people make better decisions, particularly older people. In decumulation, I think annuitization is a very complex decision that actually is obviously very important. And typically, if you have 200-page contracts, does not benefit anyone. So one question is, we're interested in what are the behavioral barriers to annuitization? How do people estimate longevity? You've seen the result. We've done work on claiming age with Social Security and also design on healthcare changes and sort of over drinks and over questions. Be glad to talk about any of that. So with that, I'm going to say thank you to many people, but particularly NIA for their support, all the people who've done all the hard work for us, and other folks as well. Thank you very much.
We have several time for questions, so I think it's really good that we are able to finish a little early so we can actually continue the discussion.
I was wondering if you could go into a little bit more detail about what it is about reducing the number of choices that reduces the load on fluid intelligence, because it seems to me that it's just simplifying the choice set.
Right. So what I really need to come up with an example where you can use crystallized intelligence as opposed to fluid intelligence. And so I'd love suggestions on this. The one that comes to mind, which I'm uncomfortable with, is people may know brand name. They know which are good and bad brands in the real world and use that as crystallized intelligence. But I'm sometimes uncomfortable with that because brand name may not correlate with performance. The idea was basically if you can do something like do a comparison more quickly, as a younger person, you do it more slowly as an older person. So that's going to go up, if you think about it sort of as a computer algorithm, it goes up with linear in the number of alternatives. So if I can give you fewer alternatives, I'll be able to use that strategy. It's clearly speculative at this point, but I mean, I think we know that what fluid intelligence involves is numerical and other kinds of reasoning. So, we hope that actually by simplifying, we reduce those demands. But that's kind of speculative, I'll be the first to admit that.
So do you think that reducing the number of choices is going to differentially make things easier for older folks relative to younger folks, or?
That would be the hypothesis, right? That basically choice overload, to the extent that it exists, will affect older people more than younger people. And there's some tentative results on that. I don't think there's substantial enough literature for us to draw that conclusion entirely. But I think but that's work that needs to be done. I mean, another example is sorting is something that probably reduces the demand of fluid intelligence. So if you were to take the plans in a health exchange or Medicare Part D, and you have a calculator and you sort by price, it makes it a lot easier because I'm not going, whereas, so it's that kind of thing. So those would be the kinds of things I think would differentiate, and that's exactly what I'm expecting, differentially help older people than younger people. Help everybody, but more so older people.
John?
Please.
Yeah, so actually, I'm one of the authors of the AgriWall study.
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry, I apologize for.
No, thanks very much for referring to it. But actually, I want to ask you a question that our critics asked of us that we weren't fully able to answer, which is
Turnabout is fair play.
which is about cohort effects, which is
absolutely.
in our case, all we could show was that people in their 50s generally did better by paying lower fees or get better interest rates as far as debt instruments. One argument our critics make to us is that, well, people in their 60s and so, when they were growing up, there weren't credit card balance transfer offers and financial instruments were simpler, so it's not that they're getting worse because of age, it's just that they're less familiar than younger generations with these products. Now, it looks like in your case, you may actually have a solution to that. It's not clear to me that the crystallized intelligence tests you have would necessarily be better, but 60-year-olds would be better at them just for cohort reasons, although, maybe if you ask a 60-year-old what a current rock band is, he or she wouldn't recognize that.
Right,
so,
right.
So I'm just wondering if in general you can say something about cohort effects and how much you think that might confound your results.
No, it's an excellent question, so let me acknowledge we only have 2 points in time, so cohort effects are an explanation. There are certainly some, so A, the measures of crystallized intelligence, my sticks example was awful because you're right, my nephews have no idea who sticks are. My mom didn't know who sticks were. It's my generation. But a lot of the measures we're using, which are vocabulary, Catherine the Great was, my mom. Even my mom was old enough not to know who Catherine the Great was. I mean, so we tend to use measures in this area that tend not to have those cohort effects. The second thing, which is not terribly comforting, is they have been doing this. This has been a large industry, and it's a very stable phenomenon. So what's happening with GF and GC is not a cohort effect. And so to the extent that that's explaining what's going on, I think we are, thank you. When we get the reviews back in this paper, you've helped. Thanks. Please.
John King, your program official.
Yes, thank you.
Actually, there's one thing I'd like to say about the last thing you said about the cohort effects, and that's not quite true.
Okay.
Because there is the Flynn effect, of course.
Yes,
which
that's
is,
absolutely true, which is a main effect of education, just for people who don't know.
Which is essentially a main effect of cohort. Now,
Right.
there's some serious questions about whether that's leveling off, and we still have no really great ideas about what was causing it. But throughout the 20th century, you could definitely see and note on particularly many of the GF kind of measures that, in fact, people were improving over time. To such an extent that when the Framingham Heart Study, which is, of course, that large study in Framingham, that originally was studying cardiac outcomes, but then became everything else, they had cognitive measures there, and then they found out that for the children, and then even for the children's children, they had to use renormed measures that they had because the old norms, basically it was like everybody had gotten better by that, fraction of standard deviation on most of those tasks. Not every single one, and that was the puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
But I only mention that because that's not necessarily, well, first of all, it's not going to save the older adults of today. The fact that their kids and grandkids
Right.
are a little bit smarter, and that's only a little bit on average. Plus also, that seems to be leveling off a bit right now. Now again, if we knew what was causing it in the first place, that would be great because that would suggest a possible strategy for remediation and all of this, but it's an unanswered question today.
How about crystallized intelligence?
So see, the thing is that since that, well, as you pointed out, the models that people build of this are not very surprising. I mean, basically, the more time you spend in educational type of experiences, the more you learn. It's not,
Right.
my undergrads from Mizzou maybe learned less than people here or what have you, but there was still, there are those sorts of time on task kinds of
Right.
things. But you're right, somebody else mentioned that, to some extent, crystallized intelligence is considered, essentially that it has crystallized in it, right? Basically, was what you were able to gain through exercising fluid intelligence that stuck with you.
Mm-hmm.
So, there are those correlations as well, which is why they end up being correlated in the data.
Right.
But clearly, you can teach people new things.
Mm-hmm.
You can teach them all kinds of facts. The question that always comes up, particularly at NIH, where we have people studying not just financial literacy, but health literacy and other things like this, is can you actually make that knowledge count when you need to make the decisions? And that's a far dicier proposition.
Right.
I mean, it's important that, for example, older diabetic patients know how to manage their disease and the basic facts of what, blood glucose is, et cetera, and why monitoring is important. But that doesn't necessarily change their behavior towards creating those differences, and it doesn't necessarily improve their outcomes. You can clearly make up cases, and there clearly are cases where that works, but it's unclear whether it's simply the added knowledge or whether there's other things well, we know that there are other factors that matter as well. And similarly, everything that you said today, where you were adjusting for education and these things, I think is the exactly appropriate thing to do. But clearly, when you're talking about the import for sort of generalized things, if I'm a scammer, I know who to target. I can target the people who are less well-educated, older, and frankly, these days, because they got databases too, people who have been successfully scammed before. That's the best predictor.
Yeah, no, and they do that actually.
Yep.
Actually, that's not always true, that the less well-educated are more easily scammed. Frequently, the targets of scams are people in the upper middle income classes or better, doctors and lawyers, because they got the money, but
really
also
sad.
because they think they can outsmart the scam.
That's a good point. There are differences for different kinds of scams in particular. It's really kind of cool, I'm running a law firm. Talking to people like Dr. Johnson here, who are just a bit past that crime. They have come into some money recently and think that they know better than, and we could do a lot of damage if for overconfidence. You're right. But and clearly where the money is important too.
Right, absolutely.
But I talk about them broader parameters.
Just as a discussion, there's a parallel issue in the financial literacy literature, which is we know the correlation between performance and financial literacy exist, and the controversy, and with all, I want to be careful with our hostess, but there are people who think there's no causal relationship, which is exactly parallel to, I think it's fair to say, to your diabetes example. So I mean that, and I think moving, so I just wanted to point out, I think there's a strong parallel there. And in fact, one of the things that I think is really important, to go back to a question you asked, which is how domain specific. I mean, what's shocking to us, and I have to admit, we're shocked that how these sort of very global measures of crystallized intelligence work for these very diverse skills, including temporal discounting. And what we'd like to do is actually sort of zoom in and tear that apart to see to what extent is it affective forecasting, or to what extent is it domain specific knowledge. And that's that's something I think is really important as the next step in this work. So thanks.
More question? I want to go back to some of the questions that were mentioned earlier, which is there is a big danger here, particularly when you look at the older old, right, where there will be a decline in capacity, yet probably there are people who can have substantial resources. And there is an area where scams can really happen. And in fact, we did see in the data a very large increase in the scam perpetrated against the elderly. And I don't know whether, in a sense, this research, in a sense, can maybe justify why this exists, because they seem really the ideal target. And I don't know whether in any of this research there are any suggestion for regulators, in a sense, on ways in which the elderly can be warned, and maybe using some of these, in a sense, technique or even the suggestion from psychology might actually be important rather than other methods.
I'm a bit pessimistic that education is going to prevent the problem, because as you pointed out, older people sometimes do not realize the decreased capacity. In fact, in general, I think it's sort of more of an institutional fix. So I could imagine there being accounts, large accounts, you basically say, I agree that after 70, if I'm going to withdraw $20,000 from my account, you have to check with my cosigner. And that would be, to me, a more psychologically informed version, because we know that it's not necessarily within people's awareness. And it just has to be done probably when you're 60. And so a lot of what this ends up saying, by the way, is the important decisions, make them earlier rather than later. And so, and pre-commit yourself to basically, the possibility, not the certainty, the possibility that your decision making will be impaired, and build in the hooks that will help you, have.
I actually think this is a very important suggestion from this study, which is the importance of really planning right? For the future and planning for the fact, there will be a time in which your capacity will be so much lower that you don't want to be put in a position or to be in a position to lose wealth. And I think, this research seems to really strongly point to that, which I think is very important.
Thanks. I think the answers are going to end up being one which is institutional rather than education.
Mm-hmm.
And I could imagine, a plug that would be something that should be encouraged by the design and regulation, as opposed to sort of simply saying there's a problem out there, let's fix it. Well, let's give perhaps safe harbor to firms to do that, just as one possible intervention. Please.
I'm just following up on that, from a policy perspective, what recommendations would you make in terms of the choice architecture? Do you think 3 options are good, 5 are better, or how does one make that decision?
So, choice architecture, one of the things I want to do on my sabbatical, which is coming up, is write a book called Choice Architecture. And one of the things is going to be, the hardest chapter is going to be number of options, because there's a trade-off. As I introduce more options, I'm more likely to get one that's closer to what you really should choose. I'm also raising difficulty for everyone doing the evaluation. So I'm going to end up saying the number is not going to be the only thing you should look at. So for example, if I sort or organize information, I can increase the number very easily. So it's going to be a little bit more like engineering than it is, a checklist. So you're going to say, can you sort these options easily along the most relevant dimension? And if you can do that, so for example, I only want cheap wine, and I can sort on that, then the number of options can grow. So I think there's going to end up being some principles, but they can be one level above quite that level of concreteness.
I think of the travel websites,
right,
where you want to decide what are you sorting based on departure time, arrival
Mhm.
time, or duration, which are
Right.
very, very helpful
Right.
in making decisions for someone who travels a lot, for sure.
right.
But I'm just wondering if there are other things that could be done as well.
Well, my favorite little poster child in choice architecture here is the notion of a smart default. Now, we did research that I'm kind of proud of, showing that defaults can change the rate of organ donation significantly. And they actually do it in countries. But of course, one size fits all defaults are making very strong assumptions about the person. And so the smart default is, imagine, for example, I knew your age, your gender, and asked you 3 questions about your health. I might be able to then forecast your longevity better than you yourself could do. And then I'm not going to say this is the policy you should buy, but just make a policy that you should buy the default and give you a reason to do that. So I think that's one tool that we've thought a lot about and have explored a bit in our health exchange work that turns out that is very powerful. And I just want to say one more thing about that, which is not because people are cruising by and being lazy. It's not that people are being fast that are they actually think about it and they choose the smart default. Now, it would be good if the people who are going fast and not thinking about it choose the smart default, because it's better than choosing randomly. It's better, to your point, David, it's better than sort of assigning people to the randomly.
During the question, they just randomly assigns you to
Right.
one of the 80.
Yeah.
Medicare
And so
Part D.
now that I think about it, my answer to your question is, could I do a better job than random by knowing some demographics for these folks? And the answer is probably yes.
Because everyone is gonna make under 132% of the federal poverty level, they're gonna get free Medicaid, but they're just, who knows what,
No.
somebody's gonna try to sell them something where they can get something for free.
Well, that's the interesting thing about the health exchange is it's a good example of you're designing for people who, I think the Kaiser statistic is, I'm gonna guess it's like 80% have never had health insurance. So these are truly naive consumers.
Right, and there's people who are there's a lot of people who refuse to take up Medicaid. They think it's a bad thing. I refuse to, they consider it welfare, even though it's free. They get free health care, and especially in a certain part of the country, I think we all know it, starts with an S, they do not like taking up Medicaid. Even though they're all eligible for it in a lot of these cities, they just refuse to take it. What do you do with those people?
Let me try a more positive spin on this, which is the one thing that's true: if exchanges go into place, there's going to be a lot of regional variation in what's done. And so one of the things that we're hoping is we're going to influence a couple of states to do things differently. And this will be for our economist friends, a Full Employment Act, because there's going to be enough variation that you'll be able to see what works and what doesn't work. And, you know, people who are cleverer than I am at econometrics can actually sort of evaluate those accidental experiments. So that's my optimistic view of that. Okay.
Well, on that, let me just say we are very fortunate to have had Eric Johnson today. As you know, we see the aging of the population not just in the U.S. but also in a lot of developed countries. I think topic like this really becomes of prime importance. I really do hope that you read the paper. It's a very rich paper that provides a lot of important results. And just say, you know, this is to me one of the most important topics. This is also why, you know, we have covered a lot of topic through the financial literacy seminar series, but these issues about decision making among the elderly is critically important. And we were so lucky to not just have, in a sense, a psychologist here, but a psychologist that can really communicate with all the economists and the policymaker. So it's very special to have you. Please join me for thanking Eric.